Hi, my name's Hunter. I'm an online ESL tutor with 5-1 Talk. In this video, I'd like to give you some tips on some of the best practices that you can use to be as successful as possible in your teaching with 5-1 Talk. So after teaching several hundred lessons with 5-1 Talk, I've come to learn through a bit of trial and error what works best and what does not work so well. So in this video, I'd like to give you my tips on how you can make the most out of your teaching with 5-1 Talk. So by experimenting and finding out what works best, I've come to the point where I can consistently book almost every time slot that I open. And so in this video, I'd like to give you some tips on how you can eventually do the same. So my first and most important tip is to give the absolute best lesson that you possibly can. By teaching to the best of your ability, you're going to have happy students who will in turn give you good reviews and book more lessons with you in the future, which will lead to the time slots that you open consistently filling up, which will ultimately lead to you earning more money. If you're interested in learning how you can improve your teaching abilities, I'd encourage you to watch my video in which I give tips on how to be the best and most effective teacher on 5-1 Talk that you can possibly be. My second tip is to be appreciative of the students who decide to book lessons with you. They're taking time out of their day and they're spending money to have a lesson with you, and so I think you really owe it to them to give the best lesson that you can. And I think this applies doubly to students who book repeat lessons with you. If a student books a repeat lesson with you, I think you owe it to them at the very least to remember their name, to remember what you worked on with them in the past, and to remember maybe some of the things that they're having difficulties on and what they'd like to improve on the most. So if you're teaching a lot of students, it can be difficult to remember the things that you've worked on with each student, and so this brings me to my next piece of advice, and that is to always look at the memos of past lessons from the student prior to the lesson. If it's a new student, I try to look at the memos that other teachers have written to see what the student was working on in the past, and if it's a student that I've already worked with, then I try to pay particular attention to the memos that I've written to the students in order to remember what I worked on with them in the past and what I likely will need to work on with them in the upcoming lesson. And that brings me again to my next point, which is to write a good and thorough memo for each student. Each time you complete a lesson with a student, you have to write a memo on the topics that you covered in the lesson, what you were working on, new vocabulary, and a few notes to the students. And so each time I write a memo, I do my best to try to really give the students some genuine tips and to try to recall what we were working on and give them some advice on what they can improve upon in the future. I think the students will really appreciate you taking the time to write a good and thorough memo, and I think this may even lead to some students booking repeat lessons with you. I think they'll be appreciative of the fact that you've made the effort to help them out, and I think that may lead to the students deciding that they want to book an additional lesson with you in the future, assuming of course that you did your best in the lesson. So my next tip, which should probably go without saying, is don't be absent for a lesson, and there are two reasons for this. First of all, if you just decide to not show up for a lesson, that's going to reflect really poorly on you in the eyes of the student, and I think there's basically no chance that if you miss a lesson with a student, they'll ever book another lesson with you, and in addition to that, I think they're going to give you a negative review for missing the lesson, which is understandable. In addition to that, 5-1 Talk also charges you a penalty if you are absent for a lesson, which is actually greater than the amount that you would have earned for the lesson. I think some people view this as unfair. However, in my opinion, if you've committed to teaching a lesson to a student, you owe it to them to really make your best effort to at least be present for the lesson. Of course, from time to time there are emergencies and things do come up. However, I think if something does arise and you absolutely have to miss a lesson, then you should do your best to let 5-1 Talk know at least a half hour ahead of time. This will give them time to find a replacement teacher, and if you cancel a lesson more than 30 minutes in advance, the fee they charge you for missing the lesson is pretty minimal, I think around $2. So that's much better to just missing a lesson or canceling it within the last half hour, in which case there's a much larger fee. This brings me to my next piece of advice, and that is to only open lesson times if you're sure you're definitely going to be able to teach. Personally, I generally don't open lesson times more than a week or so ahead because it's just too hard for me to plan if something will come up that might cause me to have to miss the lesson. I think a lot of people try to open lesson slots in the distant future with the thought that if they open students far ahead of time, the lesson is more likely to be booked. In my experience, this has not been the case at all. In fact, I find that oftentimes students book lessons with me in the last several hours before the lesson is due to begin. After teaching several hundred lessons and getting quite a few positive reviews, I've come to the point where I can rely on almost every lesson slot that I open being booked. However, as I mentioned, oftentimes the lessons are booked at the last minute, so this is something to be aware of. My next piece of advice is to not try to overdo it. And what I mean by this is to not open too many lesson slots in a row. Personally, I don't like to teach for more than 4 hours in a row, or 8 lessons in a row, because beyond this, I feel that it's just too hard for me to teach each lesson to the best of my ability. If I do want to teach more than 4 hours in a day, I'll always try to schedule at least a half-hour break every 3 to 4 hours or so. This gives me a chance to refocus and be ready for the next lesson. My next piece of advice is to try to open as many lesson slots as possible during the peak hours. In addition to getting some good reviews, I think one of the reasons why I've been successful in booking so many of the slots that I open is because I try to open as many slots as possible when it's most convenient for the students. So I hope that this video has helped you, and I hope that by following some of these tips, you'll be able to book more lessons and be more successful with 5-1 Talk. If you're already a teacher with 5-1 Talk, then I'd like to invite you to watch my teaching advice video if you're interested in improving your teaching skills. If you're not yet a teacher with 5-1 Talk, and you're interested in potentially becoming a teacher, I'd like to invite you to take a look at my video on the pros and cons of teaching with 5-1 Talk to help you determine if this is the right job for you. And if you do decide that you'd like to work for 5-1 Talk, then I'd also like to invite you to take a look at my video in which I give you tips on how to prepare for and pass your initial interview with 5-1 Talk. And if you do decide that you'd like to begin working with 5-1 Talk, then I'd also like to encourage you to use my referral link located in the description below the video. By using this link, you'll receive the fastest and most efficient service, and it will help me out as well. So I hope that this video has helped. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch.